Hi BookTube and indeed AuthorTube, because I wanted to make a discussion video. I'm very active on social media. I see a lot of authors and creative writing professors posting there about this is the way to do it, that's the way to do it, this is the right approach, this will get you to your endpoint, all this sort of stuff. And I have to admit it rather enrages me, because most of these posts assume that there's only one way to skin a cat. There's only one way to write a novel, which is, complete nonsense. All writers have to do themselves, whatever works for them. Both in terms of getting them through the process of starting with an empty page and going all the way through to typing the end, just as a sort of a process of writing, but also obviously the creative decisions that they make within that to make their book work. So I wanted to offer a plea, but also an alternative way of opening this up, that indeed there are other approaches to writing fiction. And what I'm going to go on to say is not meant as a manifesto, that I'm not going to commit the same sin and demand that the way I do it is the way that everyone should do it. It's merely a way, as I say, of trying to loosen the shackles, that there are many, if not infinite, ways of approaching the task of writing a book, as there are in the, what goes into that book, what its imagination, what its creativity bring about. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is that there seem to be, and I'm only talking about fiction, there seem to be two ways within which fiction falls. One is realism, and one is escapism. I know that in itself is as reductive as all the posts I could make about online, and indeed I'm going to broaden that out with a third option. But I want to talk about these two to begin with. So the notion of realism, that a book is to be read to enable you to interrogate and engage with your own world, the world that you live in. And this strikes me as errant nonsense, as all realism in any art form does, because the only tool a writer has are the words of language. That's the only thing they have on their artist's easel, is words. And you cannot build reality in words. So you're not creating reality, you're at best reproducing it, representing it, recreating it. Reality doesn't exist in words. Yes, it's mediated through language, how we talk about it, communicate it, share it, all those sorts of things. But it doesn't in and of itself create reality. And I think realists never are able to get past this sort of jumping off point. The best work, best realist work, sparks associations and references things for the reader in the text, that in their mind they say, oh yes, I can picture this exactly. Yes, I know that to be my experience, or I know that to be true. But they're not creating it. As I say, they're merely reproducing it. So realism for me doesn't really work. Now, escapism. Now, while I can understand the need to sort of wind down after a day, maybe when you'd be looking after children all day and starved of adult contact, you might leap into a good book, or to get away from the stresses of a day's work in an office. I absolutely understand that. But where does that end? And your life being in such a state that you need an escape from your own life. And if that's the case, why wouldn't you want to interrogate what it is about your life that drives you and leads you to want to escape it, even for the few hours that you're reading a book, which then sort of casts us back into, well, wouldn't you be better off with a book that engages and interrogates the world? Only, as I've said with my analysis of realism, that doesn't really work either. So the notion of escapism, there are two terms bandied about without them sort of being sort of tightly defined in many ways. One is used in place of the other, and that is, in order to read an escapist book, you have to either suspend your belief or suspend your disbelief in order to enter the world of the book, which is not the world outside your window. It's making lots of presumptions of difference from how we live our lives. And in that sense, it's the polar opposite of the realist novel. And I'm never sure about these two terms, because it seems to me that you have to suspend your disbelief if you're believing that the world of the escapist novel, be it sci-fi, be it supernatural, be it horror, is so outlandishly removed from our modern contemporary world that you have to suspend your disbelief that this world could possibly exist. You have to allow that that world could exist. Equally, you're suspending your belief for the duration of your journey through that book in your own world, that is the truth, objective world, because you're setting that aside in order to enter the world of the book. So they're sort of two sides of the same coin. But what I don't understand is why when you enter a book, you have to suspend your belief or disbelief at all in the first place. Because one thing the book shares is language, everyday language, even literary language, that is fundamentally rooted in our world. So you're not suspending that part of belief. And I actually would offer a third way, in a contradistinction to both realist and escapist, of a book that absolutely demands you not to suspend either your belief or disbelief, that constantly reminds you that it's a work of fiction, that none of this is true, but yet still possesses value. Now, what value might that possess? Well, this, on my part, presumes a belief in reality, or whatever you want to call it, that I happen to favour. Again, this is not a manifesto. I do not demand that everyone else has to think this way, but it suits me and feeds into my work. And that is, the perennial problem of existence and reality is it purely a material resistance of that house is made of bricks, that tree is made of wood, or is it in all entirely a construction of mind, what we call idealism? And given that I'm a writer who deals in words, and words create and transmit and mediate the input of our senses, to say that's called a house, that's called a tree, that's called a cat, that language in that sense does create reality. It doesn't create realism if what we mean by realism is a material reality, but it underpins that realism and translates that realism. But the problem here, and this is what interests me as a writer, is that I believe what we take as reality is entirely constructed by human perception and human notions, and that it works as a consensus that we all basically agree that that thing is called a house, that's called a tree, that's called a cat. And the cat has jumped up into the tree, and the tree is blocking the light from that house's window. And that behind this consensus, whether consciously or unconsciously over the millennia, lie all sorts of power relations hidden from us, and that the consensus benefits certain people at the top of the hierarchy within those power relations. But it spits out and produces this notion of what reality is that we all abide by. But in doing so, it hides certain, as I say, relationships of power between people. And that fiction can help us develop a language of critical viewing, of skepticism, of analysis, to detect other fictions. So not that fiction is creating or recreating the world outside of truth, rather it enables us to sort of pick and nip and at the frayed edges of the fictions of which we construct our lives. Now, as I say, I don't expect everyone or most people to hold this sort of view of reality and existence, but it informs all my work, for example, which is why I'm reminding people all the time within my books that they're reading a work of fiction. I'm not asking them to suspend either their belief or their disbelief. I'm not asking them to believe that what I'm producing is a version of reality. Far from it. I'm trying to get underneath that and unpick, as I say, the frayed seams of what that reality is. Okay, so that's my sort of general sort of, what is fiction analysis. And so even within that, you've got 3 possible streams. I'm sure there are more. Fiction, which I reject. Sorry, realism, which I reject. Escapism, which I reject. And my version, which obviously I don't reject, but equally I'm aware that it doesn't replace and supplant the other 2, because the other 2 are the vast majority of fiction books in the marketplace, and that's fine. As I say, writers do what they're going to do for themselves, as it should be, and within that variety, there is plenty for readers to choose from when they go into a bookshop or browse online. Okay, so the next bit is more sort of approach to my response to MFA creative writing. I've never taken a course, I've never been part of it, but I absolutely reject the notion that writing can be taught. You can teach grammar and syntax, and hopefully that was taught to you, from primary school onwards. But I don't believe you can teach creative writing. In fact, I think teaching creative writing actually has the opposite effect, that it channels you down certain preset conduits, which I don't think is helpful for the artistic vision and creativity of each individual writer. But as I say, I've never attended a course, so I could be speaking out of my backside. What do I know? I'll use the Alan Moore defence that not being au fait with a subject doesn't preclude me from expressing an opinion on it, however prejudiced that opinion is. Okay, so a typical MFA creative writing course would indulge in giving you supposedly the tools of how to construct a novel. And what are the elements of the novel? Well, the first one would be plot or story. After all, what have you got if you don't have a story? Well, first of all, what is the difference between plot and story? So a story is what we conventionally understand by the word story. A plot is everything that goes into the making of that. So it can be character, setting, language, all those sorts of things. It's the whole. But there are plenty of books that don't have plots, or don't have stories, I should say. When I see online an author refer to their story, it does enrage me, because what they're, unless they're writing the short story, what they should be saying is their novel, because a novel is way more than a story. It sort of fits into what we were saying about the word plot. But if you just want to tell a good story, a damn good yarn, that's fine. It's not going to interest me as a reader, certainly not going to interest me as a writer, because if that's all you're offering, you could get stories from the TV, you can get stories from films that do it way better than sort of yarn, what I call yarn stories. For me, a story has to have, or a plot has to have a lot more to make it a work of being a novel. The word novel, from the French nouvelle, new, which is again goes back to my earlier point about realism, about it's recreating a version of reality. It is not creating, whereas a novel should be a work of creativity, so they're never done before, hence nouvelle, novel. Unfortunately, as film theorists, film writing, screenplay writing theorists tell us constantly, there's only about 5 or 6 stories in the world. And as Carl Jung said, our narrative stories appear everywhere across the world in primitive cultures, even though there's been no means of transition, no modes of transmission between one culture to another, yet we all seem to share the same stories. I have a theory on that. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm going to stick to talking about novels. If there's only 6 or 7 stories in the world, then you have to bring other things to make them new, to make them different, to distinguish one from another. And that is all the other elements that we're going to populate this board with. one might be the prodigal son, or a revenge story, or, you know, an Oedipal triangle, you know, whatever those archetypical stories are, which I'm not terribly interested in getting to the roots of them because I don't care about story. There's only 6 of them. Therefore, how can you just rely on story for being the entirety of your novel? You need more, because it's all been done before. It's been done from primitive times onwards, from the moment that mankind first sat around a bonfire and had a skald or a bard, you know, relate orally some story or other. So story in itself is not enough. There's only 6 or 7 to go round. They need to be adorned and sort of distinguished one from another by more interesting stuff. So, as I say, I myself am not interested in thinking about story at all. That's not to say that my books don't involve story, because inevitably story and narrative, by the very nature of narrative, has to be a part of your book. But it's not front and central. It's not fundamental to my writing. And indeed, this introduces my notion, for all the points that are going to appear here, that writers often confuse what the fundamentals, supposedly, of writing. They're not. They're scaffold poles. They're scaffolding. They're scaffolding to erect the entirety of the novel upon. I mean, scaffolding, in that sense, is used for the building, the construction and the erection of a building. But if you think about the aesthetics of, you go and see Big Ben, and unfortunately your experience is degraded because it's covered by scaffolding, because it's being restored. Same thing with the Acropolis in Athens. It's always behind scaffolding because it's being preserved and restored from the car fumes, the exhaust fumes that are slowly degrading the material of the Acropolis. So scaffolding is, you know, it's an aid, it's an assistance, it's a tool, it's an instrument. It is not the thing itself. Plot is not the thing itself. The other things that are going to appear on here are not the thing itself that makes the novel. It is merely a building block, and that's the one takeaway I think I would like for people, you know, to take from this video, that what they think is the core, the centrality, the crux of their novel is in fact scaffolding. Okay, so on to the second element. 2. Character. So we said, plot in itself is not enough. You have to adorn it with other elements. And what can be more fundamental than character? You know, we are human beings reading about other human beings. Occasionally we're reading science fiction or we're reading about aliens. But in the main, we are humans. We like to read about ourselves. Character surely is fundamental to any novel. And in some senses, I'd sort of go with that. There are problems in how characters are constructed. So, for example, you have a method where you basically make a Frankenstein's monster of character, where you're taking this character trait, that belief, that motive, from all different people, either that you've read about or you know in real life or whatever. And you sew them together and you make this highly unsatisfactory and, let's be honest, at core, inconsistent character. The opposite of that, I've seen authors cite various psychological schemata, which lays out different character types and follows them slavishly, in the same way that, you know, if there's only 5 or 6 stories in the world, that makes those stories full of archetypes or stereotypes. And in a way, it seems to me that these sort of psychological schemata merely offer the author such stock character types. We want to make them more interesting. We want to make them more nuanced. So, for example, John Milton, Paradise Lost. His Satan, or was it Lucifer? I can't remember what he was called in that. But he is an infinitely nuanced character because he's the devil. He's the antithesis of Christianity. He's the evil incarnate. And yet Milton invests him with such sort of delicacy that actually we feel sympathy for Satan. He's he's the most attractive character in the whole book. You know, it's not simple. And again, this returns to character types and archetypes. It's not simple good versus evil. If I see a book where a character is described as good and his nemesis is evil, I will never pick it up. Good and evil are theological terms, they're not literary terms. Because in human nature, evil is ourselves, is our own bad behaviour, is our own deviant behaviour, is our own criminal behaviour, is our own predatory behaviour. It's not some force, some outside force. So if an author or a publicist is sort of referencing a book in terms of good versus evil, I'm not interested. It's simplistic, it's reductive. As I say, the John Milton Satan character gives the lie to that. You know, there's no such thing as simple good versus evil, that Satan is attractive, that Satan is sympathetic. That is good writing. You know, even though John Milton, as a religious man himself, would, you know, be abhorred by what Satan represented, he still wrote outside of himself and nuanced enough to give us that Satan character. And, you know, other ways of forming character. You know, characters don't go on journeys. Oh, sorry, characters in novels do. Human beings rarely go on journeys. Human beings are often stuck, which is why we have stuck in their behaviour patterns and repeat and recycle their behaviour patterns, which is why the psychoanalytical industry exists, to supposedly break them out of those cycles. I don't want to see a book where the author has plotted out the character's journey, moral journey, emotional journey, educational journey, on graph paper. And very often you can tell. You know, that doesn't mean that all writers have to be by the seat of the pants. You can still have a planning writer who plans, but don't plan using graph paper for mapping human emotions, human movement. It doesn't work that way. And if it did, again, you'd be in the realm of, you know, a novel would actually be in the realm of self-help. Human beings don't work like that in the slightest. I prefer, and again, I'm not giving this as chapter and verse, and all authors have to resort to this. I'm simply saying what I use and how it works for me. Rather than character, I prefer voice. And to me, voice encapsulates everything that character could provide and more. And by voice, I don't just mean how a character talks or thinks, because don't forget, a lot of novels are interior about their thoughts more as much as dialogue about how they speak. Because how a character, how a voice conveys, first of all, it obviates all of that sort of structured graph paper or psychological schematic or drawing traits from all of here, because a voice relies solely on the language that voice expresses itself, again, either in dialogue or in thought. And through that you can convey level of education, value system, their morals, how they view the world, how they view other characters, how they feel in sort of the dynamics of different relationships, whether they feel strong or equal or whether they feel vulnerable. All of this comes through the language of how a character expresses themselves. So I would always favour voice, and one example of that is I would never describe a character in any of my novels physically, because that is part of the other way of character construction where an author might have in mind what their character looks like. No, it's a voice, which I think brings you slightly closer to the notion of an everyman, of a universal character. It doesn't convey it automatically, and probably you shouldn't want it to, because you want the specifics of your individual voice for this novel, and in another novel you have a different sounding voice. But it's less manufactured, it's less sort of cobbled together or sewn together, it's less artificial, I believe, voice, because it comes through the language. The language is key. And an author going through would reject certain phrase or a sentence because they would realise that's inconsistent with what has previously their voices, you know, their level of education, for example. That if it was a person who wasn't particularly articulate, and then you suddenly put in a slightly poetic metaphor, you'd have to reject that because it's inconsistent with what's gone before. So that's character. Again, notions of protagonist versus antagonist. which has unfortunate echoes of good versus evil, or main character. I'm not interested in any of these because they're too reductive. They're too, this is character A, this is character B, this is how they interact. In the same way that when I used to write drama, you're always told, where's the conflict? Because conflict in drama on the stage is the fuel that drives the 2-hour play or however long you've written it for. But when that conflict is sort of glommed on, is put in artificially, it's transparent. The audience can see it a mile off. That too often conflict actually equates not to drama but to melodrama, because it's a bolt-on. In the same way as I've seen advice that characters have to have goals. No, they don't. I mean, they can. I'm not saying that it's outlawed, but they don't have to have goals, and that returns us to the notion of the book being a journey for the character, whereby they have a goal at the beginning, and by the end they've either achieved it or they've not achieved it. Again, human beings on the whole don't tend to work like that. Yes, we have goals, of course. Even an author has a goal in the writing of any book, but the formula that goal has to be the focus of the book is, in order, that's the whole character's métier, the whole being. Again, no, it's a scaffold pole, as indeed is character, which I think is probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say about this. Character itself is only a scaffolding pole to get to the type of book that you want to, put out there. Okay, 3. Setting. Oh, I've gone lowercase for some reason. Or description. Now, in a way, you need setting not only to locate your book. So is it in, as with Hilary Mantel, is it in, that period of history? Or is it in 1980s Los Angeles? Or is it in a farming commune, in sort of an idealistic society? Whatever it is, you need a setting. And very often, authors will go to town and give you loads and loads of description, what's called world building. I don't believe, to me, world building should be done in no more than a couple of lines. You suggest the world. Let the reader fill in the details. The reader is sophisticated enough and has read enough books to be able to place himself entirely in the milieu of your world. Is it in Tudor England? Is it in 1980s Los Angeles? You don't need much to suggest those for the reader to fill in the detail. So there are authors who give loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of description, and personally I think it's too much. But the other end of that is when, really with sort of character stroke plot top heavy writing, that's the focus of the book, either or both is the focus of the book for the author, that when that character is on the move, in a train, in a car, on foot, description of where they're moving through is given almost like a list. That it passes, that the character notices a roadkill has been run over in the road, notices a beer can is crushed underfoot, notices that a fence has been singed, has obviously been set on fire at some point, and the scene, all this sort of stuff. But they're only ever given, as I say, like a list. And that's just as bad a sin as overwriting, because then the reader goes, well, why are you telling me this? What is the relevance of this? Unless you're going to return and call back to those features. And too often they're not. They're just, they're sort of filler, I'm afraid. They're filler. And they're not even good filler like the top heavy description says, because at least that might have literary value. It's just, as I say, it's a list. It's skeletal. It adds nothing. So to me, description, as I say, setting you could do in two lines. Description, I think, has to be metaphorical, has to involve images that feed back and relate to what is happening in the book. Not necessarily at that moment, but you might call back to it by the end, or it might call back to something in the beginning. That, I've written three flash fiction stories, I think, that don't have any human characters at all. No, they don't even have voice. They are just description. And through that description, that is the drive of the story. You know, description because of the metaphors, because of the imagery. And description can be as much about absence, something missing, something extracted, something erased, as they are about presence. So don't think that description is about what is there. It can also be implied what isn't there. And there are your metaphors. But again, they've got to tie in with what your overall ambition is for the book. So description, I think, has to be carefully modulated. You don't want it to be just a skeletal list, but equally you don't want it to go on for page after page after page. You certainly don't want it to go on to world building, you know. It's a tool, you know, it's an absolute piece of scaffolding, description. And yes, if you're writing literary fiction, the nature of your language, the nature of your images in that description, in your description, can be the meat of your book, absolutely. I'm talking more about where the sort of myriad of description, lots of space in the book devoted to it, is just sort of sat there as background and context rather than being active and interacting with the rest of the book through its images, through its associations, etc., etc. So those are, I think, the three main elements of conventional fiction. Then you have other things like theme or idea. You have language and metaphor. You have style, or what I'm going to call form. And in some ways these could be above the line. The reason I've put them below the line is they go back to what I was saying about plot and story. These all feed into elevating mere story into a plot, the other things. So theme and ideas is also a tricky one to judge, because you don't want to be preachy. The example I gave of John Milton, how even though he would be abhorred by Satan, he was nuanced and fair-minded and even-handed enough to make his Satan quite sympathetic. So an author doesn't just want to spout their own ideas. You know, you've got to be more even-handed than that. Otherwise, it's not good fiction. Theme is usually tied in with metaphor. How are you expressing your central theme? So, for example, in my book, 3 Dreams in the Key of G, which is a book about nature versus nurture when you're in a combat zone, you know, does nurture effectively become nature when you have no choice? You're born into one side or the other in a combat zone, in a divide. And I wrote a lot about genetics and the human genome in that. And I used the metaphor, the central metaphor from which the whole book sprung, of the genetic 4-letter alphabet from which all DNA is formed, and obviously we're all formed from our DNA. If it contained typos in those 4-letter alphabets, that would lead to genetic disorders and genetic conditions. And equally, how a 4-letter alphabet of DNA was infinitely more sort of creative and could create every single species of animal on Earth just through its 4-letter alphabet, compared to our own 26-letter alphabet, which strives manfully to create art and media and all other things. So those are the two. The central image was the DNA sort of genetic code as an alphabet, and as an alphabet that could contain typos. So my theme was continually done metaphorically. I think you know, as I say, you can't just spout out your ideas. There's the difficulty in modulation, you know, when you want to get ideas across, when you want to portray sort of historical movements and things like that, is the difficulty is the modulation of scale. So you can get these sort of great epic books like War and Peace or Germinal, where the novel is always leaning towards the individual. It is an art form of the individual, of the main character, even though I've rejected the notion of main characters and protagonists, all that sort of thing. I'm reverting to the language of the MFA. Therefore, you can have a love affair or a ménage à trois as the sort of central focus within a much wider thing of a revolution or a labour movement or mass migration, whatever it is. It's really hard to foreground the two so that they are, in terms of scale, proportionate to one another. The author will tend either to focus on the central relationship, on the main character and their experiences, to hopefully, and usually flawed, back project the wider historical movement, or they'll focus more on the wider historical movement, and then you wonder, well, why have we got these, these two people at the centre cluttering up the stuff? If you think about a war or many fronts, one journalist can only cover and report on one bit of the front. They don't know what's going on there, they don't know what's going on there, or at least they're not seeing it and observing it with their own eyes. And in a way, grand sweeps of history in novels function similarly, that where your journalist is embedded and reporting is where your main characters are, and the main characters will filter and refract the historical movement as it affects them. But that doesn't necessarily mean what's going on over here and what's going on over on there is going to appear in the book, and if it does, it's probably realistically not through their eyes, because they're not there. They can't be in all these different places at once. So that's the problem of great sweeps. You get family sagas, multi-generation, to portray history, and that's fine. But again, it's all too easy to lapse into characters representing positions or representing viewpoints, rather than being, fully fledged, fully drawn out sort of human characters in themselves, given the limitations of what I said earlier about character. That, again, this is where writing can become quite preachy, or at least the struts of the scaffolding are on show openly when they shouldn't be, because this character is, and I think the book The Conquerors by Andre Malraux does this, where this character is a communist, this character is a member of the Kuomintang, this is a spy from France. Each character is there interacting with each other, but equally that they're sort of representing a different viewpoint of thrown on the shared history, and it's unsatisfactory, and as I say, it comes over as, what did I say? Scaffolding. Language and metaphor. Well, I've sort of talked a bit about language and metaphor, particularly in relation to setting and in relation to theme. Metaphor in itself is a really interesting notion, whereby our language is so imprecise that more often than not we have to resort to saying there's this thing, but we also have this thing that's like it, because by bringing in this second thing, that illuminates and enlarges and expands our understanding of the first thing, because the language in and of itself is not sufficient to convey what we mean by the first thing. So all fiction, in a way, is metaphorical or involves metaphors, because we're talking about one thing and bringing a second thing in order to sort of highlight and underpin it. But I'm not talking about metaphor for metaphor's sake. I was talking about metaphor, as I say, for underpinning and underscoring things like theme, things like ideas, things like setting, even things like character, potentially. So what I want to come to really is style versus form. So style, I'm not sure, is a useful sort of notion within the context of this, because writers have individual styles and they'll bring that to their work, and it can be analysed retrospectively when the book's finished, out in the market, and people are reading it and criticising it. They can analyse the writer's style. I'm not sure it's useful for the writer at any stage to analyse their style during the process of writing, unless they're consciously saying, okay, I'm going to write a book that's very different from my normal style. But that aside, I don't think style is a useful concept. However, form absolutely is, because I believe, as I say, a novel is not about realism. I think all a novel can tell us, I mean, as I say, hopefully it can give us, sharpen some of our tools for analysing and being sceptical about fiction in the real world, but small f fiction, not literary fiction or bookish fiction. But so I believe that all fiction does really is tell us about novels. What can novels do? What can't they do? What do we think a novel is? Where does a novel begin and end in terms of feeding into those other questions about realism, about escapism and all that sort of thing? But I actually think all a novel, it's such a self-contained art that really the only thing it can inform us about is the novel, and perhaps language as well. So form is absolutely fundamental to our probing of what is a novel, because the novel is unlimited in what it can be, pretty much, in the same way that the form in which we choose to write on those novels is also, or should be, unlimited. Unfortunately, it isn't in most cases. You know, the notion of a linear novel, going back to what I was saying about escapist, yarns. Most yarns are linear, and the fact they might have flashbacks, which is not a literary form, it's a movie form, but parking that aside, the fact that they have flashbacks doesn't preclude it still basically unfolding in a linear fashion, because the drive is basically in one direction. It just takes points to pause in order to feed you some more information through a flashback. So the linear form is the most basic storytelling form, and to me the least interesting and the least engaging. You can have radical forms that encapsulate the whole of that novel, that give meaning, so, if there's such a thing as meaning to a novel, but at least give meaning to that particular reading experience. It comes all through the form, where maybe it pulls all these other aspects, together, and you see why that particular form was chosen. For example, Marc Nash' book, The House of Leaves. Some readers respond to it purely as a yarn, as a work of supernatural horror. But the form that Danielewski has chosen, whereby the layout of words on the page is sort of changes and is, I would use the word, architectural, because he's writing a book that is in a way a labyrinth. It's labyrinthine in form, in the same way as the house at the centre of it is sort of labyrinthine. He uses lots of different framing devices of different characters seemingly being the narrator, and then their torch is passed on to someone else, and you think, oh no, this is the narrator. The whole thing of the book is about sort of schizophrenia and mental illness. That comes out through the form that he's chosen of all these different voices, each seemingly the one in charge when none of them are in charge, plus this sort of labyrinthine, never-ending form of the house and of his architectural layout of the text. To me, that is a book that is entirely derived from its form, and in my mind brilliantly so. Take the notion of time travel, the Time Traveller's Wife down the line, Robert Silverberg, I think it was Silverberg. Time travel stories are great yarns, because it's such a fascinating concept. But the point is, it is such a fascinating concept because not only is it something we might yearn for, but actually it's deeply flawed. This whole notion of how can the future send someone back to change the nature of the past, because if they're successful, then the future from which they were sent back won't exist, it'll be a different future. And that is a fundamental paradox at the heart of the logic of time travel. And I have a time travel novel. It's called Time After Time. And unlike Down the Line and unlike The Time Traveller's Wife, which are good yarns, time travel yarns, the form of my book, Time After Time, absolutely embodies the paradox of time travel. I employ the scientific theories, whether you hold them as credible or not is entirely up to you, of both Schrodinger's cat, and the butterfly effect from chaos theory. My novel is structured after both of those in order to explore the notion of time travel and the paradox at the heart of it. It's a multi-universal, parallel universe theory. It doesn't matter whether I believe it or not. That is rigorously explored through the form, as I say, of the novel itself and its parallel alternative realities being set up, being put into play through the butterfly effect and Schrodinger's cat. So, for me, form is the absolute apotheosis of all of this. Form, which in itself is a scaffold, but it takes on more than just being a scaffold, because it's everything, it's the whole edifice of the building. And it goes back to that thing of what I was saying of, you know, novels can only tell us about novels, and the form of the novel, as much as its language, is a major part of exploring as what a novel is. So there you have it. That is my response to people telling you how writing is done, as if there was only one possible way of doing it. The whole notion of creative writing MFA courses, which I think are an anathema to genuine creativity. The fact that what most people take to be the fundamentals of novels to me are just scaffolding, and then it ultimately comes down to two things. Novels to me come down to two things: form and language. So, I hope you found that of some interest. Till next time, thanks very much.